building up for that recall. He brings an Arbiter right over top. Once the probes are there, he brings the dropship in. He manages to take positions. Here comes Luxury. Welcome to Brood War Highlights. This is a matchup between the champions of last season, SK Telecom, led by Fantasy and Bisu, against the dominating team of this season, KT Rolster, led by Flash, who is undefeated on the season and hasn't lost in 10 games. The opening match is on match point. It is between Fantasy and Hoja. Fantasy of SK Telecom and Hoja of KT Rolster. Fantasy spawns orange at the 7 o'clock position. Hoja spawns green at 1 o'clock. The game opens with Fantasy blocking off his choke to deny Hoja the scout. He then fast expands and builds an academy. Hoja goes for 3 hatch mutas, and he builds his 3rd hatchery at his natural expansion. Fantasy gets 2 firebats and a medic out and heads over to Hoja's base. They head down to bottom right, presumably to stall Hoja's 2nd expansion, but the first mutas out come down there and clean those up before heading over to Fantasy's base to harass. Then we see a typical muta harass, both players teching and macroing up. Fantasy gets a pretty large force of Marines and medics, heads into the middle of the map, and Hoja has 3 lurkers there. He does a stop lurker and takes out about a whole control group of Marines and medics, coming in with the mutas to support. But Fantasy has 2 starports up, and he's starting to churn out wraiths. They continue to battle, mutas and Marines, in the middle of the map, until Fantasy gets enough wraiths out, and he heads over to Hoja's base. Hoja's not ready for this at all. He sends his mutas home, but right over top of Fantasy's Marines and medics, he loses a few mutas and Scourge there. Meanwhile, these wraiths are running amok in Hoja's main and his natural, killing drones at will. Finally, Hoja gets some Scourge and his mutas back to the base, but these wraiths manage to take out all the mutas and Scourge, and they continue killing these drones. Fantasy really gaining the economic advantage here, and Hoja has no choice but to retaliate by attacking Fantasy's natural ramp. He brings his lurkers there to the bottom of the ramp, and he manages to kill quite a few Marines, but there's a tank and Marines up around the corner, and those lurkers just can't reach and can't get in close enough. The wraiths come back, and he manages to drive away Hoja. Then Fantasy gets 2 dropships built and heads back up to Hoja's main. With his wraiths and dropships, he then ferries Marines and medics into the base. Hoja does manage to defend, but not before Fantasy takes out both his evolution chambers, so Fantasy's going to be up in upgrades as well as economy. Then Fantasy heads down to the bottom right to the 5 o'clock expansion that Hoja's just got going, and he manages to take out that hatchery as well before Hoja can clean up with Hydras and Dark Swarms. So now Fantasy takes a page out of his teammate Boxer's book, and he builds a nuke silo, but he doesn't even have to leave his base to get this nuke down. He sends a dropship with Marines and medics up to Hoja's main, and he waits there at the edge. Meanwhile, Hoja's expanded to 6 o'clock, which is right outside of Fantasy's main. Fantasy has his ghost just inside the wall of his main, and he's able to nuke the 6 o'clock expansion, and Hoja's clearly not aware of where this is. This nuke kills a bunch of those Hydras, and a lot of that hatchery's life, but meanwhile Fantasy is now attacking at Hoja's main with that drop of Marines and medics. And of course, a minute later, that same ghost nukes 6 o'clock again. This time he takes out the hatchery and a bunch of those drones. Fantasy's now rolling with science vessels, irradiating a bunch of the defilers. He heads down to the 5 o'clock expansion, starts irradiating those drones. Hoja GG's. Fantasy wins the game, and SK Telecom is up 1-0.
Game 2 is being played on Outsider between Bisu for SK Telecom and Luxury for KT Rolster. Both these players have been doing well this year. Bisu is 4-0, undefeated on the season, although he hasn't played particularly difficult competition. Well, Luxury is 5-1 on the season. He's looked pretty good this round. Luxury opting to open with a 9-pool build, which is fortunate for him because Bisu isn't fast expanding here and is instead going for a 2-gate Zealot push. He moves out with his first 3 Zealots. Luxury has some Lings out though, but he's forced back to his natural to defend. He has 1 sunken morphing here and about 10 Lings, which is enough to force Bisu back to his base. Bisu now teching up, getting his gas, and putting down an expansion at the 730 position. Now Bisu actually slips a scouter here into Luxury's base, so he knows what he's doing. He knows he's going for those Mutalisks. He sees the Spire building. Mutalisks out now for Luxury. He chases these Corsairs back to Bisu's base with his Scourge, and Bisu caught a little bit unprepared, surprisingly. The Scourge come in, force these Corsairs back, pick off one. The Mutalisks are just able to take out the rest of those Corsairs and the cannons that are morphing. Bisu really down here. These Mutalisks do a lot of damage, so he's forced to try and counterattack here with his Zealots. But 3 Sunkens and a large group of Hydras behind the Sunkens, and Bisu has no speed, he has no Citadel, he's just totally unprepared for this, not even close to getting High Templars. Luxury chases these Zealots right back to Bisu's natural. Bisu putting up a lot of base defense. Now Luxury just camps his Hydralisk out and lets about 2 rounds of Hydralisk build here. He knows he's got a lot of time here. Still no speed for Bisu. He comes out with his Zealots trying to fight these Hydralisks off, but there's just no chance. They're busting right in here, take down all these cannons. The probes are forced to come out. They go down too. Bisu goes down here. He's just got no chance against this pressure. The KT fans go wild, and Luxury manages to tie this set up at 1-1.
Game 3 is on Fighting Spirit between Telecom's Best and KT Rolster's Flash. As I said before, Flash is undefeated on the season. Best not looking real strong this year, but his strongest matchup is against Terran. He spawns 1 o'clock position, teal. Flash spawns red at the 7 o'clock position. He's content to sit back, play to his strengths, and go for a macro build. He goes 1 factory into expansion, and Best expands to his natural and goes for quick observers, and he manages to get a good scout on Flash's base. He even sends 2 observers into the back of the base, one of which gets killed by missile turrets, but that other one gets in there. It's great to see Protoss players putting an emphasis on scouting. He responds by accepting Flash's invitation to play a macro game. He goes to 3 bases and then Arbiter Tech. Flash goes to 3 bases and then Science Vessels. He then does a nice little maneuver here where he brings his Science Vessel up to Best's natural, and he manages to get an EMP off on Best's first Arbiter. Finally, after 11 minutes of peace, these players clash in the middle. Flash has tanks, vultures, and Science Vessels. Best, Zealots, Goons, Arbiters, and a shuttle full of Templar. Best now expanding to a 4th and 5th base in bottom right. Flash takes the battle to that bottom right bridge. Best pushes back. Flash sets up his siege tanks. An EMP goes down on those Arbiters, but a stasis goes down on that Science Vessel and the Goliaths. And the Templar get busy. Psy Storms going down on these clumps of tanks that Flash had to set up hastily. They're grouped far too close together. A lot of those tanks go down, and Best manages to hold his ground here, keep his Arbiters alive, take Flash's tank count down, and he's still got those 4th and 5th expansions. He's up in economy now. So Flash really needs to do some damage here. He brings some Vultures in to the 4 o'clock expansion. The Best's army comes down and meets Flash at the bridge. Flash does not have the tank count to take on this army. Storms go down, Stasis go down, and Best manages to wipe out Flash's forces here. All Flash can do is try to expand up at 10 o'clock, but there's an observer there that sees it. Zealots come in and clean that up before it even is half done. Then Best pushes down the left side of the map into Flash's forces here. Stasis goes down on one Science Vessel, another Stasis goes down on Flash's other Science Vessel. Flash forced to rely on Comsats to see this cloaked and larger army. More Stasises go down, and that army gets wiped out. A minute later, Best is pushing across the middle of the map. Flash is unable to stop this snowballing advantage that Best has. He GG's, loses his first game of the season, and SK Telecom goes up 2-1.
Game 4 is being played between Hyuk and Violet on Heartbreak Ridge. Hyuk for SK Telecom has played quite well this year. He's 4-1, although those are primarily ZVZ matchups. Violet is 2-0 in Pro League. He hasn't seen a lot of playing time, but he has been playing quite well this season. Now, this game starts out very standard for a PVZ on Heartbreak Ridge. Hyuk going for a 3 hatchery build, putting down his 2nd and 3rd, then getting a Spire up and moving into a 5 hatchery build. Very, very standard for a Zerg player on this map. Now, Violet for his part is doing what he's sort of supposed to as well, getting a fast expand, putting down some extra gateways, getting his Citadel and Corsairs out. Very standard play from both players. Now, first sign of aggression here is some +1 speed lots move out for Violet. They head straight for Hyuk's natural. Hyuk has a nice SimCity though at both his natural and his 3rd. These Zealots come down here, don't like what they see and end up just camping in front of these natural. Now, Hyuk's turn to push out. He forces these Zealots all the way back into Violet's natural and sets up a bit of a short contain here until 2 DTs end up popping out here for Violet and force this group back. Now, these 2 DTs come down, morph into a Dark Archon. We've seen that a lot in this matchup. Sort of a new strat here for Protoss players. Lurker's out now for Hyuk, and he forces Violet back in once again. Violet without any observers, and Hyuk gets a nice contain here on Violet's troops. Mutalisks out now for Hyuk. He's going to use these Mutalisks to try and snipe the High Templar of Violet. He knows that's the key to this matchup. Now Violet breaking this contain, observers out finally, and then he starts ranging out in the field with his troops, with his big army. But he does this very intelligently. He has 2 observers out in front of his troops. He knows exactly where these Mutalisks are at all time, and gets a huge Maelstrom on Hyuk's Mutalisks here, storms them all, kills everyone, and Hyuk knows he is in deep trouble now. Violet now quickly puts down his third base here. He knows he's ahead in this game. He didn't lose a single High Templar to those Mutalisks. And Hyuk trying to get his fourth base down. Huge storms go down. Another Maelstrom followed by a Psionic Storm. And just storms going down everywhere for Violet. He just has so many High Templar now that he just pushes right in, takes out this fourth base, and starts moving towards the towards the third base. Hyuk tries to make his stand here in an awkward position. He's forced to come through the small choke. More storms going down. Hyuk's army just melts to these storms and the Archons and the Goons. He moves straight towards the natural. That's GG. Very well played game for Violet. Hyuk goes down. Big use of Dark Archons in this matchup, and that goes straight into the ace match.
For Game 5, KT sends out Flash. He is surely hungry for revenge after losing his first game of the season. Telecom sends out Fantasy. He's won 6 out of his last 7 TVTs. The map is Moonglaive. Fantasy spawns white at the 8 o'clock position, and Flash spawns blue at the 4 o'clock position. Both players go for one factory into expansion, and they float the command centers over to their naturals. Flash builds an armory quickly, and he gets Goliaths out, whereas Fantasy builds an academy and he starts pumping vultures out. The first battle line is drawn on the south side of the center plateau, but both players are content to macro up. Flash expands to 1 o'clock for his third, and Fantasy down to 6 o'clock. Flash then starts to pump out some vultures, both players trying to get some map control, but Fantasy manages to corner him up at the 12 o'clock position. Flash retreats up that ramp and tries to defend there, but he's way outnumbered, and Fantasy's vultures mop this up. Soon after, we see that Flash has the first dropship out. He brings 4 vultures over to the 5 o'clock position, where Fantasy is trying to expand. He stalls that expansion, then hands over to the 6 o'clock position, where he kills a few SCVs, and Fantasy comes down here, cleans this up with some tanks and vultures, and then continues that expansion at the 5 o'clock position. Meanwhile, Flash is building up a fleet of dropships. He comes across the north side of that plateau, where Fantasy doesn't have much defense. He kills these vultures here and 1 tank. He then picks up and flies down to the west side of that plateau, taking out 3 of Fantasy's tanks, doing an excellent job of using his mobility to take on Fantasy piecemeal. He then sets up outside Fantasy's base and starts shelling from across that canyon. He then leapfrogs in, flies over those missile turrets, and takes out a lot of Fantasy's SCVs here with his Goliaths. Shortly after that, he picks up a lot of those tanks from across the canyon and flies in above Fantasy's supply depots. He manages to take out almost all these supply depots. Fantasy trying to use the few dropships that he has to defend this, but Flash is still macroing hard. He's got Fantasy outnumbered. Fantasy GG's. Both players go 1-1 in the series, but Flash is supported by Violet and Luxury. KT takes the win. SK Telecom drops to 4-3 on the season. KT defends their first place position with a 6-1 record.